In this episode, I talk with a fellow pastor on how to live during Trump 2.0. That's coming up. Hello and welcome to Church in Maine, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. So, Donald Trump has been president again for about 6 weeks, but it kind of feels like 6 years, doesn't it? If you're someone who might be critical of the president and his policies, there is a question. How do you act, especially knowing that it's going to be 4 years? And where do you find hope? In this episode, I talked to David Gray, who provides an answer to this question. David is ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA and is the senior pastor of Bradley Hills Presbyterian Church in Bethesda, Maryland. He's a former acting assistant secretary for policy at the U.S. Department of Labor, and he was a counsel to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Government Management and the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee. And he was also a legislative aide to several members of Congress. So as you can see, he is very much a creature of Washington. He was also a fellow at the New American Foundation and is a current fellow at the Niskanen Center. He lives with his wife and 4 children in Bethesda. Now, I've been doing a lot of reading on the old interwebs these days, and one of the things that I find fascinating in talking is that I don't sense a whole lot of hope. And so I'm curious about how Christians can find hope, can lean into hope in challenging times. And I think that this conversation with David is a good place to start. So let's listen in to this engaging conversation with David Gray. Well, David, thanks for joining me this afternoon. I wanted to kind of start off by getting to know a little bit about you, your background, your faith background, and then also then moving on maybe to your background especially in public policy, because I know you've worked in a few different think tanks, and kind of talk about that as well.
Yeah, great to be with you. Great to be with you, Dennis. Just having been a pastor here for the last 16 years, but before that was 8 years in government, and have been at sort of 2 think tanks, sort of in between and around that. And so, serving as a lawyer for Senate Governmental Affairs Committee and serving several senators and representatives, and then serving at Department of Labor in the early 2000s, and then at New America, and then Niskanen here, and then increasingly, my life has been moved, towards ministry, which I always had strong interest in growing up, and there was a pre-ministry group in college. I always thought I would. There was a spark there somewhere, and if you believe in calling, as folks in the Reformed Presbyterian Church, I'm in the Presbyterian, believe strongly in sort of it's got to be God's timing, and so that line moved more and more towards ministry, and sort of less and less policy for me, I guess, since really 97, and just joyfully ministering at church here in Bethesda. Been in the DMV since I came to work on the Hill in 97, and then and have enjoyed this ministry a lot. Every year is different. COVID changes contextually around in terms of the last election, et cetera, being significant among other things.
So. And I'm kind of curious, I know you have a role at Niskanen Center. What is that role, or what kind of is your area of focus at the Niskanen Center?
Yeah. So Niskanen great, and it had some of the it has and it has always had some of the entrepreneurial nature that I loved at New
Hmm.
America back in really the late '90s, when some of the idea for New America came out of a class that its founder and I were in grad school, and then when I ended up joining it formally in 2005, those entrepreneurial days of a think tank are kind of fun. I'm technically in the political science sort of area in New Scannon, so I cover just a number of areas, try to be supportive of folks who are doing different areas of work. The areas in think tanks that I've specialized in the most in my think tank career is really in workforce education and labor. And so I
Mm.
do that. I was started as deputy assistant secretary, then acting assistant secretary for policy at labor. And so I directed the workforce and family program at New America from '05 to 13, and then was a
Mm.
senior fellow from 13 to 16. And so that's been an area that I've always had an interest in, and that's come out of largely working on at being at Department of Labor and leading the policy team there. And then before that, I was at Senate Governmental Affairs and did a number of things. But I also got brought in to do some education work. No Child Left Behind in 2000, and some of the other
Mm-hmm.
education work on the workforce and ed and workforce world. So I guess if there's an area of policy that I focused on the most, it's that. But I've also, I was heavily involved in fiscal issues for a while. New America got interested in debt issues in a significant way 10 or 15 years ago and spun off a group there. And I was supportive of that and have supported its education team. So those are some of the areas, Dennis, that I've been most interested in policy. Yeah, I'd say sort of domestic workforce and education and labor.
Okay. And I know you are the senior pastor at Bradley Hills in
Mm-hmm.
Bethesda.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of tell me a little bit about that congregation? What is it like? What's its makeup?
It is a great congregation. It is a super fun congregation. It's so a Presbyterian Church USA, 650 people. We're blessed with a lot of families with kids, which is great. We have 4 kids ourselves. So for
Mm.
my wife and myself, it's just a very blessed. It's been a great community to raise our kids. It is. It's in Bethesda, so it's in Montgomery County, Maryland. So the demographic of Montgomery County, Maryland, is reflected by any church in where it's located, of course. And so it will have a number of very well-educated folks who will end up in a lot of life sciences. You can walk to NIH from where I am,
Mm.
and that makes for just a lot of medical folks who are uneasy about. Well, any federal worker, of course, is uneasy about things these days. It is large enough that it's got some people who are coming into the new administration, as well as more people who come out of it. And what I mean by that, it reflects Montgomery County, which is essentially a blue county, but it's large enough that it's got some purpleness to it, and it's in a part of Bethesda that has a number of folks who are well known publicly. So sort of as I look out my window, sort of around the area, so that creates this sort of interesting dynamic in terms of the area that we're in, and then it's in addition to the mission and music, and we have a lot of concerts um, and education things. It's neat in our wacky, fun campus that we have. So we created an interfaith space. There's a wonderful Jewish congregation that started renting space in 1967 and
Mm.
it's not left. And then we recruited a mosque in 2019. And so every week you've got the 3 Abrahamic faiths who will worship in the same space at different times every week. So at 1:30 today, in 20 minutes from right now, it's Juma prayer. So down the hall there'll be a room of good friends, Muslim sisters and brothers who will be praying Juma prayer at 1:30 today, and then Ramadan starts next Friday.
Mm.
Tonight at 7:30 in the same space, it'll be turned around for Shabbat service for Bethesda Jewish congregation in that same space. At 8:30, our first service on Sunday will be in that same exact space, and then our later bigger service is in Covenant, is in the main sanctuary. But having a school here and an Alzheimer's support group, and then a mosque, a synagogue, and a church, it creates, amongst many other things, a wonderful, I think, pretty dynamic and diverse community.
Yeah, I lived in DC in the mid '90s, and most of it was actually in Silver Spring.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
What fascinated me was just the diversity in all of its forms in Montgomery County, from the different people, but also just the different ways of living and everything. That's always been a fascinating place for me.
Yeah. Gaithersburg, I think, is technically, when they do the surveys of like the most diverse religious parts of America, I think
Uh-huh.
Gaithersburg, which is north of here in
Hmm.
Montgomery, is number one. And Silver Spring, I think you're right, Dennis, is like somewhere like three of the top 10 most diverse sort of micro communities in the U.S. are in Montgomery County. And I think number one is Gaithersburg.
Yeah. So being that it is in your church is in Bethesda, and as you said, was not too far from NIH.
Yeah.
Um, as people like to say, it's a company, that whole area is a company town. Um, I'm assuming that you have a fair number of people who work for the federal government. How are they? What is the mood of the congregation right now with all of what's going on with people losing their jobs and all of that, and and just the general uncertainty?
Yeah. Yeah. So it is there are a variety of different reactions, but there's great concern from a significant number of folks, and some for different reasons. It has a complex sort of system of influences. So what I mean by that is it is definitely true that there's a decent number of federal workers. If we were downtown DC, would we have a higher percentage of federal workers? Possibly. I don't know. Possibly. Or younger workers who've been earlier in their career, who, if they were on probation, were more likely to lose their jobs than more senior folks. I don't know. But we certainly have a fair number of federal workers. So far, we definitely have some people who have lost their jobs, and some that are high profile who've been like individually fired by the new president himself. So because there's some high profile folks, there have not been as many younger folks who've lost their jobs yet in the congregation. There have been a number of
Hmm.
folks who had their teams have taken a big hit, and they've lost a bunch of people who work for them at NIH. But that's as of last Sunday. Like this Sunday, when I talk to folks, I'll be interested to see, because they're all sorts of, every week there's a whole new level of folks losing their jobs, and so lots of anxiety. Definitely folks whose teams have been strongly impacted. Definitely folks who have lost their jobs, um, and yet and folks who are sort of concerned about their like where, even if they don't seem to be targeted yet, if they will be later on. So there's a great amount of anxiety generally throughout the DMV. Congregations, whenever there's issues of trauma or anxiety, do their best to try to be supportive. And so we're trying to think hard about how do we be supportive of federal workers, because we certainly have our share. And then, of course, there are other layers of anxiety as a result of the change of administration, where other groups, which are present within our congregation and substance, in addition to federal workers, are also have anxiety and negative impact on their lives, and feel afraid and potentially targeted for other reasons we could talk about, in addition to the status of being a federal worker. But we're definitely thinking hard about how to help people in several groups, in addition, but with federal workers being one of those groups.
Would other groups include, such as like immigrant communities?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that within the congregation, certainly the immigrant communities are significant. And, as we talked about, this is a diverse area. You have a number of folks who are first generation, who've come to the U.S., to the DMV. We have as I mentioned, we've got a mosque here, a partner that worships here. We have a number of folks who are members of the congregation. Our November new member class, I think, had five, if you count the U.S., five different countries of birth origin in the new member class. So there's a significant group of people from different continents around the world, members of the congregation. Um, and so folks, who are concerned about just trying to educate in terms of what rights and responsibilities folks have, and even if someone has all their papers in order, which most folks do, there's still great anxiety about being targeted or going to the supermarket, and do I have to carry my passport, to the swimming pool because I could get picked up. There's a lot of anxiety. There's disinformation. There's areas of sort of education and support for immigrant communities for a number of reasons that are around here. LGBTQ I plus community is another one here, which has represented our community. We've been supportive for a long time of that community here, and members of our church who are members of that community also feel like this is a difficult time for a variety of reasons because of the change of the administration. And so that's another group that we're looking at supporting here in a number of ways. I spent part of yesterday working on some outreach to sort of strengthen the visibility of support for that community here, and also do a couple things publicly that do that. We've incubated a sort of religious outreach group. This is 2 or 3 years ago, focused on that community in DC. And so, how do we strengthen the support for that community is another one. I think that, of course, there's a number of folks who aren't in either group, but have a particular sort of interest in issues where they see sort of the unraveling of the social fabric, or things that they took for granted, like how U.S. foreign policy would operate in the world and how we were perceived. Democracy as an institution. There's some voters who care less about that, but there are some folks here who care quite a bit about that. There are areas around reproductive rights or gun control or pick your issue, for which some of the executive orders may or may not directly affect them, but there's great anxiety about issues they care about being changed. So that's a whole nother group that I think we spend some time trying to think about. I spend some time in sort of counseling folks who are just feel very unsettled, and in some cases just either depressed or their nerves are raw. And so even if they're not in a category where there's a direct targeting, so to speak, feel very unsettled by what's happened. And then, of course, there's other folks who are happy by what's happened, feel better about things than if the election had gone the other direction. And so, honestly, one of the opportunities and challenges is trying to be pastors to a broad group of people, and some who I may or may not agree with on every issue, but want to be supportive of. Yesterday, just sitting with some folks who just really, there's just some real heartache and anxiety around the pace of change, and even if it doesn't seem like it directly impacts, it's hard to sort of get away from the breadth, depth, and pace of changes, and it's very unnerving for many folks.
Mm. So that kind of brings up the question, kind of probably the meat of this interview is, what does it mean? What does our kind of religious witness look like in this era, especially in the role of public policy? Coming from where I stand and sit, it's kind of interesting. You expected change to happen. I don't think you expected it to happen as fast or as dramatic as it has happened. And you talked about it being unsettling, and I think it has been, and not knowing how best to respond to it. And I'm kind of curious, how are you as a pastor kind of dealing with it? What does it mean? What does kind of religious witness mean in this era? And especially where it intersects with public policy, and how can that influence public policy?
Yeah. There's a lot, gosh, so much to it. I appreciate your framing of that, Dennis, too, in terms of just, no one expected, I think, the sort of pace and speed of change. So, part of that, just pastorally, is just thinking about the long game for a moment. I think most faith traditions do call us to a longer game. In other words, we're under God. If someone has a faith tradition, a belief that there's a higher being, that there is a God, that God's been around a lot longer than we have, and will be here a lot longer than I'm on Earth. And so it does change the time horizon a little bit to have. I think faith does help us to have a time horizon and a sense of a foundation when things seem unsettling. And so that's not really public policy, but I think it's important pastorally to remind people that there's the God who was our help in ages past is our hope for years to come, and there is a rock of faith to grab onto when things seem to be swirling around one. The long term is an important piece that I keep coming back to a lot, which is to say you look at the pace of change in 1 month, and you start to see articles pop up here. There's an article in the Post today about some of Musk's changes have been unsettling to some of the senior aides in the Trump years, right?
I saw that. I got an email from that today.
So there's a little bit of a burnout issue potentially here. Like, if we're 2% of the way through the Trump years, are we going to have like 4 years of exactly like this pace of change where like every 4 hours I get an alert on my phone where something significant has happened? Like the post office is being, brought under the Department of Commerce. Okay, all those are sort of significant. And Bannon would say, well, there's a strategic plan to sort of just overwhelm by moving quickly. I'm not so certain that pace can be maintained for 4 years. And at some point, the coalition starts to have a little bit of fractures. And does Musk want to keep doing this for 4 years? Does 2026 have a change in the House of Representatives, which would be a game changer for some of these? There's a number of reasons why I think looking at the long game about public policy is important to sort of survive the short term and think a little bit longer term matters, and I will go back and I keep reminding my congregation that when we talk about, Dr. King's quote about, the arc of justice, the moral arc of America is long and it bends towards justice. We tend to look at the framing of the latter part of it. It bends towards justice. That's great. But we don't often, or at least I think it can be easy to skip over the first part, which is that arc is long. I think King used the word long. Bends toward justice, but it's long. And so, Dr. King reminds us to take the long view, and to have hope. Now we want to try to bend that arc as quickly as we can, but on the other hand, self-care is pretty important, and we don't want to burn out either. And so pastorally, there's just part of my thought is just, if you're just overwhelmed because you can't put your phone down and you're stuck inside looking at your television and you're just watching news all day, it's going to be overwhelmingly negative. And this is a marathon. 4 years is a long time. Self-care is important. So that's part of my thought about the role of the public witness. Part of the challenge for me currently in this is, given the pace of the number of things that are sort of flying around, is trying to get folks to focus strategically in response. So we're having debates even this week about, what's the immediate way to help refugees? And then other folks are here how do we help the USAID? The grants aren't going through USAID. There are folks who are going to be so negatively impacted. We have to immediately deal with that. And then how do we, but if we can't do everything as a congregation. And so if we do those two things, are we going to have both the funds and the bandwidth to do something significant in May? And we don't know exactly what's coming in May. So I'm trying to encourage when so many folks in faith communities or others are generally pulled in a lot of directions, trying to sort of unify folks and find common vision. And we're only 4 weeks in, so it's at some point I do think the barrage of changes slows, and you sort of see what they're going to focus on as some things that require some sustained work for the administration. And that may help focus some of the work of faith communities. I think faith communities, and then I'll take a break here because there's just so much that comes to me, Dennis, you're ultimately, the call of Micah 6 to do justice and to love mercy or compassion, I'd say, and walk humbly with your God. Jesus calling, I'll just say as a Christian here, I know you have a diverse audience, but as a Christian, for me, but out of a tradition that revered the Hebrew Bible too. We're to love God with all that we have and love our neighbor as ourself. And if what we're doing in policy is not it is counter to those ideas, that's a challenge. If what we're doing is consistent with that, then I think that takes us to a better place. And so that is a lens that I might encourage folks to look through, for starters.
One of the things I've been listening to a few different podcasts, and our common acquaintance, Jeff Kabasser, has just recently interviewed Jonathan Rauch, in his new book about how important Christianity has been to American democracy and kind of the influence of Christianity in American democracy, but how that has kind of influence has kind of waned. And he also kind of focused especially on the American evangelicalism and its kind of ways that it kind of has compromised itself. But I guess he also kind of talks about the waning influence, especially of mainline Protestantism, kind of its willingness to be so secular that it doesn't really offer a difference. And I guess I wonder and think about what is the importance of religion in our culture as a whole in kind of keeping us, I guess, a more civilized culture. And what has been the effect of losing that? Because I think that it seems like as we've become more secular, as I think someone like Ross Douthat has said, we are not all just reading the New York Times. It's becoming much more kind of, the word that comes to mind is savage, just kind of more mean-spirited. So how do we kind of help or maybe build up in our faith communities influence in our culture, or at least be a witness to a different way of being in our culture?
Yeah, there's a lot of good thoughts in there. The mainline Protestant tradition, including my own Presbyterians, our form of structure very similar to some of the democratic representative government from the founders on, because there were a lot of folks from Presbyterian and other traditions that are mainline Protestant traditions who were there to help shape the government and the founding father sort of pool. I think one of the things that is most sort of interesting is the decline of organized religion generally is relevant to the current moment in multiple ways. And so it is true that since the 60s, institutions generally have been declining in participation. Presbyterians, PCUSA has lost 55% of its members since 2003, and that mirrors some of the other mainline ones. Now, there have been folks who've left over ordination of folks in the LGBT community in 2011 in our case, so you lose a lot of Southern churches, and that exacerbates the change. But it is this general decline in this rise of what they call the nuns, people who mark that they have no religious affiliation. So people experience religion. I don't know that people are become the transcendent is necessarily less important to people, but I do think the way people consume religion is more individualistic. So we started broadcasting in 2012. We changed nothing for COVID in terms of how we broadcast our services, other than it was me and musicians and nobody else other than the same live stream team that we had since 2012. So we have this significant group of folks who are around the world in the country who watch the services, but it's a much larger percentage of our, and we find ways to engage them, and that's great. But it's not the same as being there in person. And we have a lot of folks who will just stay at home and individually consume religion as opposed to being in person in our community or deeply getting engaged, except on Christmas or Easter. And but I do think there's something that's going on in even in their own living room and watching a service like ours or someone else's, listening to your podcast that reflects the need for the transcendent. And so part of our challenge for religion at this time is to think about how we do that in a way that is sort of life-giving for the culture and sort of connects folks together, so that you're right. You mentioned some of how we are less tethered together um, and more savage. And I do think part of that is just the inability of folks to find connections through things like religion, right? And this is the bowling alone analogy. One thing that our current moment that Trump has sort of leaned into is this whole concept of trying to return religion to the way it was. So the MAGA movement, Making America Great Again, has this, obviously this whole underpinning of nostalgia. The idea of making it great again. The whole word "again" is about nostalgia. If we can just make it the way it was once, that being America, then that's worth doing. And let's try to make it the way it was in the past. And that takes place in the religious context, where for mainline Protestants have lost general members. There are churches like our own that continue to grow and buck the trend, but I don't take that for granted. And we only can, maintain and grow slowly, I think, in a culture that's becoming much more secular. But evangelical churches have lost numbers of significance, Southern Baptist Convention and others. And so I do think there's a little sense from the MAGA movement and from the current president. There's a messaging in there that says, look, I know that your numbers are down. I know that your kids and your grandkids aren't going to church the way they were, but elect me and we can, make religion great again. We can, part of returning to that culture of the 1950s and pre-Vietnam was that, your church will be more robust. There was a transactional outreach to that community. But part of the way that gets implemented is there is a divisiveness to it. It plays a role in trying to elevate particular cultural issues, which then ends up dividing or putting other parts of the culture down, as opposed to lifting everybody up. And that has been a divisive problem, but it has attracted certain elements of Christianity. And, we can read the Atlantic article this month and others on Christian nationalism to think about where, that where those kind of arguments have resonated. I think part of the counter to that, while it's difficult, continues to be, to be hopeful and helpful. The arc is long. It bends towards justice. God cares about the church now as much as God has ever cared about the church. Church is not ultimately my church or my congregation's church or your church. This is God's church. And I think the sacred is experienced in different ways, but that desire for the transcendence never goes away. And churches which lead with compassion and love and trying to find ways to find common ground, as opposed to those that are looking for wedge issues, I think do have a really important part to play in a culture where, if I'm wrong and we are at this pace of change and sort of fracturing and trying to break things, there's an element within the last 4 weeks of let's come in as a new administration and just like creative destruction. Like let's break some things first, and maybe they can put it back together better. Maybe I think that's their argument. But if they're wrong on that, and the creative destruction ends up creating more brokenness than ultimately something replaces it's better. So in other words, you can fire the postmaster general and bring the postal service under commerce, and the argument is, well, we're going to improve the service that you receive as Americans, right? Same thing with like let's break into the Social Security system and make sure. Like there's a lot of risk to that. And if government is not, if all folks do is break things without improving it, it's made a real dent in the social fabric of America. And churches become more important than ever in that world, in trying to pick up some of the slack where people have depended on other institutions. And it's possible that this creative destruction experiment that we've seen in the last 4 weeks, if it continues for long term, does more harm than good. There's a lot of people who think it's doing more harm than good now, and I have trouble arguing with them on that. I tend to agree. So far, I'm nervous. But the church just by being itself, I don't think it's up to the church to sort of fix. 4 years is a long time, but the role of the church as a uniter in a world of creative destruction through government is going to become elevated. And so I suggest people stay at their posts as pastors, rabbis, imams, etc., and do the work that's ours to do. I don't know, we're involved in advocacy as well as others are, but I don't think our role is to drop being pastors and become straight advocates. I think the role of the church providing social fabric becomes more important if government goes from being part of a social fabric strengthener to a social fabric breaker.
I was actually last night, I watched a video on YouTube. It was from a NBC station out of Philadelphia, and they interviewed a young man who worked for the IRS and who was fired that day. I think it was a day or two ago. And it was actually someone who had voted for the president, for President Trump, and believing that things could get better. And he went into this job, that he had been in this job probably only for a few months, hoping to do better things and make the government better. And you could just see the dejection on his face, the sense that his heart was broken, that he had worked with people and how he was treated too, that it was just, he came into the office, things weren't working. And, you just kind of got this email and were kind of ushered out. And he did talk about how other people would, the higher ups were trying to do things, trying to do what they could to help. And that was hard, but it feels like right now the church needs to help this. How do we help people like him? Because I think that there are a lot of people right now. I have read a lot of stories about people who've lost their jobs, and that seems to be one of the things that the church has to do, is to help people like this worker that, just lost what they thought was going to be a job that they could make a difference, and now they don't have it.
Yeah. It's so discouraging. I feel so bad for that, and for lots of other stories that are emerging, and that will emerge in our own congregation as well. So as I go around and sort of check with folks and check in with folks, there's a lot of anxiety around it, and there are examples of that story. So, the role of the safety net. You now have an unemployed worker, a dejected worker who wanted to make a difference, who's probably, he may or may not be rethinking his vote, but the reality is his circumstances have changed. And I do think people are, whether or not the church, has a way to provide material resources. That's a whole discussion here about just sort of financially, like, is our responsibility to members, to folks in the broader community, to folks globally who are out of, no longer receiving USAID. The need is greater than our capacity financially to be there. The one thing I think sort of spiritually in walking alongside folks and providing help where you can is, I do think people are drawn to faith communities during times of great anxiety. And I would argue that our own numbers sort of bear that out around the election and since the inauguration. And so it may be that that someone like this, to use an example, obviously I don't know who this person is, but this person is looking for support. They may turn to a faith community in such a time.
Yeah. And I would hope that could happen. And I think it's probably going to happen with a lot of people whose worlds are being torn upside down right now.
Yes, I think that's right. And as I talk to colleagues too, who that's their experience as well. So we're when I come in on Sunday and I talk to someone who's, last week, someone who'd received an email on Friday, at the end of the day, Friday, that their job was terminated, and then they come into church on Sunday and it's just at a different, there are a number of those conversations.
Mm-hmm. So I think that leads to, and you had talked about this a little bit earlier, or maybe hinted at it earlier, is um, that many of our contexts are not all people on one side politically. There are what are called purple congregations, um, and I'm kind of curious, how have you kind of maneuvered that in your role as pastor? And helping the church be more, being a unifier, not necessarily to have be partisan, but to kind of bring people together.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of there are some purple churches where you're just not going to talk politics at all, and so the
Mm-hmm.
decision is not, there's nothing going to be publicly sort of done in that space. I think that it's hard to. I would have a hard time ignoring the context around us from the pulpit completely, and so there's just too much that's affected by the context of the administration change. So I've been addressing it publicly, but hopefully in a way that is I'm trying to find things to say that are helpful and hopeful. I keep going back to that. So I don't want to just sort of publicly just sort of grieve and just emote without saying something that advances the ball that people can do something useful with. I'm not, because I think it just makes people feel worse then.
Mm-hmm.
And but as pastors, we all have our own emotions, and we have to both process those, and hopefully through prayer and the Spirit be able to lead the congregation to go forward in a way that's hopeful. I do find even folks in the purpleness of our space, so even folks who supported the president, I'm not sure are as thrilled, kind of like your IRS example, with the way some things have turned out. Like
Mm-hmm.
I think the pace, kind of like the Post article, not everyone signed up for or expected the pace and some of the things that have happened. So I do see in our own congregation folks who I know who voted for the president will say, well, I don't know about this. And so there are some ways in which we all can come together. And one of those issues when I say not sure about this has to do with some of the dealing with folks who are on the margins of society anyway. And so even folks who will be saying, I'm kind of disappointed, even though I voted for the president. I'd like to help deal with this issue. You've got people on both sides of the aisle, therefore, working on whatever that issue is. And in our case, it's dealing with some of the people on a particular area of the margins. And then lastly, I'd say even folks who I've talked to or members who are going into the administration, most of them are mature enough to sort of say, we're happy with it, but we get that there's some pain on of displacement, of losing the jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd say, I'd feel the same way. And so are on the same page with the rest of the congregation about doing something in terms of supporting these people during a transition, even though they feel like in the long term it's the right thing for the country. So I don't know. That's fine. Where do you find ways to be helpful and hopeful, and be helpful in finding ways for both communities, both segments, and one is larger than the other in significance. Folks who are sort of upset for one reason or another outnumber the folks who are excited or happy by the way things have turned out. But there are ways in which they are ending up working together on some things we're started to lean into, but it's still early,
Mm-hmm. So, how do we kind of, especially as pastors, but even congregations, pace themselves in the next few years and being a witness? As you said, you can't react to everything, but that's hard, especially as you've said, just like you, my phone will lit up every moment about something. Um, how do you kind of keep pace and basically, for lack of a better term, not freak out all the time?
Yeah, I mean, so just here's where the church has something to contribute to society of substance. I mean, the church at our best is centered, has a long-term eternal view,
Mm-hmm.
can teach and equip people with with practices that help center them in times of anxiety. And so, prayer and reading sacred texts and meditation are things that come out of the church context. We're good at that. We have something to contribute to that, and I think society needs that. And people who are just so tethered to the latest news piece do well to try some of the practices that have sustained members of the church for centuries. It's time to rediscover those spiritual practices. They do take me to when my prayer life is best, my devotional life is best, I am the calmest during the day to face whatever challenges that I face. I do think prayer matters. We continue to pray. I continue to pray for the president, continue to pray for the country. Religiously, he was very impacted in his convention speech in July by having almost died from an assassin's bullet. That July experience in Butler County, Pennsylvania, or wherever is an amazing experience, and I don't take for granted the opportunity of that to influence him. Now, I haven't seen as much evidence the last 4 weeks, admittedly, that it's been a wake up call to provide the kind of whatever you think of Bishop Buddy's speech, she was arguing for receive the kind of mercy you receive from God and apply it to marginalized groups and extend that mercy to others. But she started with the idea of you've received that kind of mercy. You've had a transcendent experience, and let's live that. And so I don't totally give up hope that maybe he will do that as a result of that. The part of the challenge is that advisors, in particular the faith advisors too, have been been more of an echo chamber and less of a challenging group to sort of say, here's really where God in scripture calls us to. And it's really not to retribution and to meet evil with evil, or to seek the welfare of a narrow group, or to seek to divide. There's a different ethic that Jesus lived, and it's to reflect the same gracious love that God is at the center of God's being since the beginning, and to extend that and reflect that to others through us, to give more to the world than we take, rather than the opposite. So but praying that kind of servant leadership comes to Washington is some role of the church, and spiritual practices have never been more important to sustain us towards the long term.
Why do you think it's important to pray for the president? And that is something that I've done myself. So
yeah.
I'm not asking it kind of how this is weird, but I am curious, why is that important to you? And in doing that.
Yeah, right. And different people can, I respect folks who have a different sort of view of either both prayer or the folks we sort of pray for. I mean, so if you take Jesus, if you're upset at the president, but you take Jesus' words seriously about, meeting things that are very difficult with love, or loving one's enemies, to use a phrase, or to, thinking about the Sermon on the Mount and how we treat those who persecute us, Jesus is not all that into retribution. He's into mercy, and takes a particular interest in those who persecuted him, and those who were particularly mean to him, or those who were seen as, some of the greatest sinners. Some of his dialogue with the Pharisees or other people, Zacchaeus or others who had particular roles that were roles of power, of influence, took a particular interest in their turning around. I mean, the repentance. As we approach Lent, I don't think God ever gives up on anybody, and therefore, if we're going to take seriously our role, the role of the church, I don't think we give up on anybody either. And so, to sort of dismiss someone as saying, "Well, I'm just giving up on that person. I hate them, and I'm not going to pray for them for that reason," I'm not sure that that's consistent with biblical witness or God's will. I think it's something different. Secondly, I think prayer, if you believe prayer matters, and that it does have intercessory prayer, that God hears our prayers, Jesus prays for us, and we're called to pray for other people, then I don't dismiss the idea that, that if I pray for my friend who in the congregation who's going to surgery next week, because it can help the witness of the Spirit be present, then I have that same belief that the witness of the Spirit can be present in helping bring wisdom to a president where wisdom may be needed. And then third, I think it also changes us too. I mean, I do believe the wisdom of the age, that prayer, whether or not it changes God's mind on any given day, it does have an impact on us that matters. And I don't spend a lot of time interacting with the president, but I do spend a lot of time interacting with a variety of different people during the day, and some of those interactions are very, very calm, but some of them are challenged, and I'm trying to be present when I've got a million things going on, and that someone comes in with a crisis. When you think about extending yourself in prayer to someone who you disagree with, I do think that can help. At least it helps me treat the other person in the building who I'm interacting with whom I may disagree, with a little more grace if I've just prayed for somebody outside the building with whom I disagree.
Mm. As we kind of wrap things up, one final question I want to ask is, what do you think is the role or will be the role for the church over these next 4 years? How do you think things will shape out for us? What choices do you think that we will make? And maybe finally, what advice would you give, especially to local congregations who are feeling unsettled right now and want to know what to do over the next few years?
Yeah. So I'd say sort of focus would be one thing. I think, there's so much that's coming at us that we cannot do everything. We cannot do everything well, or we're going to get burned out. And, congregations, even of size, with resources, you can't do it all. And there's so many things on policy, even within the religious context, if one's going to sort of pick an issue. The debate, the First Amendment debate between, the free exercise clause and the establishment clause, just that's its own interesting discussion that one can have, and the way this religious liberty is used on both sides of the aisle. And so there's specific policy issues around around religion that where religious arguments are made on different policy issues. So I'm saying, congregations could get involved, of course, on a variety of political issues that relate to arguments of faith, because they're certainly being used, or they could get involved with ballot initiatives or voter registrations or the 2026 election. But we can't do everything. And so my part of my thought is, strategically see if you can get one's congregation to focus around a few things and do them well. The next few years are going to be unpredictable, and the best case scenario is that the institutions hold, but there's all going to be this barrage of really challenging stuff that comes out. That's the best case scenario. And so, if it's like the mail system is like, there's all these sort of threats that seem to be going on with to some of the institutions with Doge, but we call the passport office and the Social Security office. People are still picking up the phones. A lot of the work is still getting done. Things are still seemingly moving forward, but it is possible things go completely off the rails, and that the worst case scenarios on democracy or on global war or on some sort of bird flu crisis that we're not prepared for, and HHS no longer has the staff to deal with. You can think of or the checks stop running. You can think of a bunch of scenarios where the risks that come with this much creative destruction, it comes with risks, and if the even medium bad happens, let alone the worst case scenarios, I think you need a little bit of a reservoir of ability to react to those kind of scenarios. And if the church is just run itself ragged trying to play whack-a-mole with every daily issue. I think that the church has a particular role in times of deep crisis after 9/11, et cetera, where we need to have some reservoir of energy and capacity to deal with, I hate to say, with one of these scenarios that are particularly challenging for us as an institution. Because if we're going to break government, there are not too many other institutions like the church which has the kind of reach, real estate, and relationships within a community. That reach, real estate, and relationships within a community that the church would have. And so stay vigilant in advocacy, but pick an issue. Think about the long term, either the worst case scenarios or the best case scenarios, which is remembering God loves the church, but God loves God's creation, and that includes you and me. And I don't think God has abandoned God's care for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then I do think that self-care, this is we're beloved of God, we're made in God's image. That includes, those who we disagree with politically. They're also made in God's image. And I think grace to oneself and others is always the best policy.
Well, David, thank you for this. I think it's kind of one of those times when you have to be hopeful instead of optimistic. And I think that this is a hopeful message in the long run.
So good to connect with you, Dennis. I think you're right about hopeful versus happy or optimistic. Hopeful is the right word, and that's it's a good way to end on. I hope we have a chance to connect another time, and I'm glad for our time today.
Thank you very much. All right. So what are your thoughts about this episode? Where do you see hope during this time? How are you trying to find that hope? And is there any hope in our current situation? And I believe as a Christian, there is hope, and that hope is in Christ. But how does that play itself out? I'm curious to hear what your answers are. And please, I would love to hear them. If you have any thoughts about this or thoughts about anything, send me an email, and you can send that to churchandmain, all one word, at substack.com. I'll include a link to David's church, just so that you know a little bit more about him. And I do want to thank David for taking the time to interview with me. I thought it was a good interview, and I hope that it's been helpful to you. Now, if you want to learn more about this podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, visit churchandmain.org. Also, you can visit churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. You can also donate there as well. And I hope that you will consider donating. That helps to pay for the cost of this podcast, and hopefully to keep me chatting with some interesting people. I hope that you would also consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and that you would leave a review. It helps others find the podcast. That is it for this episode of Church and Main. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.